The bitter cold nipped at Faith Jones's cheeks as she stared helplessly at her dwindling pile of firewood. The howling January wind of 1885 threatening to tear her small cabin apart. The blizzard had started 3 days ago without warning, and now she was completely cut off from Golden, Colorado, the nearest town being 5 miles away through increasingly impassable mountain terrain. Faith shivered and pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 24, she had thought herself prepared for the harsh Colorado winter, having moved west 2 years prior after her parents' passing left her their modest inheritance. The freedom of the frontier had called to her, but now that same wilderness threatened to be her undoing. "Just another day," she whispered to herself, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air of her cabin. "The storm has to break eventually." She tossed another precious log into the pot-bellied stove, watching as the flames greedily consumed it. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, and snow piled higher against her door and windows. Faith had already pushed her small writing desk against the door when the pressure from the mounting snow threatened to force it open. 5 miles away at the Broken Spur Ranch, Zachariah Zane pulled his sheepskin coat tighter as he stared out from the barn doors at the swirling white nightmare. The 30-year-old cowboy had weathered many Colorado storms in his decade working cattle, but this blizzard was different. It had an anger to it that made his skin crawl. "Zach, you're a damn fool to be thinking what you're thinking," said Hank Roberts, the aging ranch foreman who stood beside him. "I didn't say anything," Zach replied, his voice rough from the cold. "You didn't have to. You got that look. The same one when you rode out after those rustlers last spring." Hank spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Nobody should be out in this. Not even you." Zach's thoughts drifted to the small cabin up near Lookout Pass. The Jones woman lived alone up there. She'd moved in 2 years ago, kept to herself mostly, selling herbs and remedies in town. Pretty little thing with auburn hair and a smile that could warm a man faster than whiskey. "That Jones woman's cabin is all by itself," Zach said quietly, "if she didn't stock up proper before this hit." "And what are you going to do about it? You ride out in this and we'll be finding your frozen carcass come spring thaw." Zach's jaw tightened. "She might need help. So might 100 other folks. You can't save everyone, son." But it wasn't everyone Zach was worried about. Something about Faith Jones had stuck with him since the moment he'd first seen her in town, bartering her remedies for supplies. The way she held herself proud but kind. Independent but not cold. Different from the other women who'd come west looking for husbands or running from something. "I'm taking supplies up tomorrow at first light," Zach said firmly. "Storm or no storm." Hank sighed heavily. "Then I better help you pack because you're going to need more than that stubborn streak to get through this." The night passed slowly for Faith. She huddled under every blanket she owned, listening to the wind battering her cabin. By morning, the small window was completely covered with snow, and the cabin was dark despite the dawn hour. Faith lit her lantern, conserving the precious oil, and moved to check the door. It wouldn't budge. Not even an inch. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She was sealed in by the snow. Her food would last another week, maybe 2 if she was careful, but her firewood was down to just a small stack. Without heat, the bitter cold would claim her long before starvation. Faith took a deep breath, fighting down her fear. Panic wouldn't help her now. She had survived losing her parents, the journey west alone, establishing herself in a community that initially viewed her with suspicion. She would survive this too. She just had to think. At the Broken Spur, Zach rose before dawn, dressing in layers and packing supplies. Food, medicine, blankets, and tools. He'd chosen his strongest horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Brutus that could push through deep snow. "You're still determined to do this fool thing," Hank said from the doorway of the bunkhouse, watching Zack prepare. "I am." "Then take this." Hank handed him a small flask. "It ain't much, but it's good whiskey. Might keep your blood flowing when the cold tries to freeze it." Zack nodded, touched by the gruff show of concern. "I'll be back before dark." "You better be, or I'll have to come looking for your sorry hide, and my old bones don't take to the cold like they used to." The ride that should have taken an hour stretched into 3 as Brutus struggled through snow drifts that sometimes reached the horse's chest. The wind had died down, but the temperature had dropped further. Zack's beard was crusted with ice, his gloved hands stiff despite the heavy leather. His mind kept returning to Faith. He'd spoken to her perhaps 5 times in 2 years, brief encounters in town or passing on the trails. She'd once given him a salve for a rope burn on his hand, refusing payment with a gentle smile that had stayed with him for weeks after. There was a quiet strength about her that drew him, but his life on the ranch left little time for courtship, and she never seemed interested in the rough cowboys who passed through Golden. When Zack finally spotted the chimney of Faith's cabin, his heart sank. The small structure was almost completely buried in snow, only the top of the roof and chimney visible. No smoke rose from the stack. Either she was conserving fuel or— he refused to finish the thought. Faith startled at the sound, something above her, on the roof. She stood still, listening. There it was again, a scraping sound, followed by a thud. Someone was up there. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking from disuse. "Is someone there?" The sounds paused, then came again with greater urgency. "Hello," she shouted louder. "I'm in here." A muffled voice responded, though she couldn't make out the words. Hope surged through her veins for the first time in days. Someone had come. She wasn't alone. Zack had nearly missed the cabin entirely, only the distinctive red chimney pot marking its location beneath the mountain of snow. He'd left Brutus tied to a tree on higher ground and proceeded on foot, sinking to his thighs with each step. When he reached what he thought was the cabin, he began digging, first clearing snow from the chimney to ensure it wouldn't be blocked, then working his way toward where he thought the door might be. The labor warmed him despite the biting cold. Then he heard a voice from below. Faith's voice. She was alive. "Miss Jones," he shouted. "It's Zachariah Zane from the Broken Spur. I'm going to get you out." He couldn't be sure if she heard him, but knowing she was alive redoubled his efforts. He dug with renewed vigor, clearing a path to where he estimated the door would be. It took nearly an hour of constant labor, his muscles burning despite the frigid air, before he reached the wooden door. It was locked. "Miss Jones," he called through the door, pounding his fist against it. "It's Zack Zane. I need you to unlock the door." Inside, Faith scrambled to move her writing desk away from the door. Her fingers were stiff with cold, and the desk seemed twice as heavy as it had days ago when she'd pushed it there. Finally, she cleared the way and reached for the lock with trembling hands. "Mr. Zane." She called through the door. "The lock's frozen. I can't turn it." Zack pressed his ear against the door, hearing her struggling with the mechanism. "Stand back, Miss Jones. I'm going to have to break it open." He waited until he heard her retreating footsteps, then took a few steps back himself. With a determined grunt, he charged forward, driving his shoulder into the door. The wood groaned but held. He backed up again and threw himself forward with all his strength. This time there was a splintering crack as the lock gave way, and the door burst open. Cold air rushed into the cabin, but Faith barely noticed. Standing in her doorway was Zachariah Zane, snow covering his broad shoulders, ice in his dark beard, his normally tanned face reddened by cold and exertion. She had never seen a more welcome sight. "Mr. Zane," she breathed, tears springing to her eyes unbidden. Zach quickly stepped inside and pushed the damaged door closed behind him, propping her desk against it to keep it shut. Only then did he turn to fully look at Faith. She was pale, her auburn hair hanging loose around her shoulders, bundled in what appeared to be every piece of clothing she owned. Beautiful even now, with dark circles under her green eyes and chapped lips. Those eyes were fixed on him with such gratitude that he had to look away, suddenly self-conscious. "You're nearly out of firewood," he said gruffly, noticing the nearly empty wood box beside the stove. Faith nodded, finding her voice. "It was supposed to last the winter, but the cold." "I brought supplies." Zach rubbed his gloved hands together, suddenly aware of how cold they'd become during his digging. "Food, medicine, some tools. My horse is up on the ridge. I'll need to bring him down and get the packs. You came all this way. For me?" Faith asked softly, the realization only now fully dawning on her. Zach met her eyes then, something unreadable in his gaze. "Couldn't leave you up here alone in this storm. Nobody should face this kind of cold by themselves." Faith felt warmth spread through her chest despite the chill in the cabin. She hadn't expected rescue, certainly not from the quiet cowboy she'd exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with over 2 years. Yet here he was, having battled through a blizzard to reach her. "Thank you," she said simply. Knowing the words were inadequate, Zach nodded once, then turned back to the door. "Need to get Brutus and the supplies before dark. I dug out a path, but it won't last long in this wind. Get whatever wood you have left into that stove. I'll be back with more." Before Faith could protest, he was gone, pushing back into the swirling snow. She rushed to feed the stove with her precious remaining logs, then gathered every pot and container she could find. If Zach could bring snow in, they could melt it for water, saving her dwindling supply. Her mind raced. A man in her cabin. It wasn't proper, but neither was freezing to death. And Zach Zane had a reputation as an honorable man, according to town gossip. Still, the thought of spending days in such close quarters with a virtual stranger sent an unexpected thrill through her that wasn't entirely due to fear. It took Zach 3 trips to bring Brutus and all the supplies down to the cabin. Each time he returned, his coat was heavier with snow, his movements slower. On the final trip, Faith was waiting by the door with a cup of hot tea she'd made from melted snow and her precious remaining tea leaves. "Drink this," she insisted, pressing the steaming cup into his hands once he'd deposited the last bundle of supplies. Zach didn't argue, grateful for the warmth as it spread through his chest. The cabin was still cold but noticeably warmer than the howling wilderness outside. Faith moved about, organizing the supplies he'd brought: dried beef, beans, flour, coffee, sugar, a small bottle of whiskey, 2 blankets, and tools including an axe. "How did you even find me in all this?" Faith asked as she worked. "The cabin must have been completely buried." "Red chimney pot," Zach replied, his voice rough. "Remembered it from when I rode past last fall, stood out against all that white." Faith paused, surprised he'd noticed such a detail. "That was clever of you." "Lucky," he corrected, setting down the empty cup. "Need to get more wood." "Your supply's almost gone." "But you've just come in from the cold," Faith protested. "And the light's fading," Zach countered. "Won't be able to see to cut properly once dark sets in. Need to work while I can." Faith knew he was right, but hated the thought of him going back into the freezing weather. "At least take more tea with you." She quickly prepared another cup, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. His gloved fingers brushed against hers in the exchange, and even through the leather she felt a jolt of connection. Their eyes met briefly, and Faith saw something flicker in his gaze before he looked away. "Won't be far," Zach said, his voice oddly gentle. "Just around to the woodshed." Only after he'd left did Faith realize she didn't have a woodshed. Whatever wood he was planning to cut would come from the trees surrounding her cabin, a daunting task in this weather. Through the frosted window, she watched his silhouette move through the snow, axe in hand, toward a stand of pines that edged her property. Even bundled in his heavy coat, she could see the strength in his movements, the determination in his stance. Zachariah Zane was not a man who gave up easily, a quality she suddenly found immensely appealing. Faith busied herself preparing a simple meal from the supplies Zach had brought. Bean soup with dried beef would be sustaining and warming. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a habit she'd abandoned days ago when the silence of the storm became too oppressive. Outside, Zach worked methodically, cutting branches from the nearest pines. It wasn't ideal firewood, too green, but it would burn with enough coaxing. His hands ached from the cold despite his gloves, but he kept working, driven by the image of Faith's pale face and the nearly empty woodbox. He'd come this far. He wouldn't let her freeze now. By the time darkness fell fully, Zach had amassed a respectable pile of wood. He gathered as much as he could carry and made his way back to the cabin, where golden lamplight now spilled from the windows, a beacon in the gathering gloom. Faith opened the door at his approach, the smell of bean soup wafting out to greet him. The contrast between the bitter cold and the relative warmth of the cabin made his skin tingle as he stepped inside, depositing the wood beside the stove. "There's more outside," he said, stomping snow from his boots. "I'll bring it in after we eat." "You've done so much already," Faith said, taking his coat and hanging it near the stove to dry. "The soup is ready if you're hungry." Zach was suddenly aware of how hungry he was, having eaten nothing since dawn. "Smells good." They sat at Faith's small table, steam rising from the bowls between them. The cabin was simple but neat, with handmade curtains and a few books stacked on a small shelf. Personal touches that spoke of Faith's character, practical but appreciative of beauty. "I haven't thanked you properly," Faith said after they'd eaten in silence for a few minutes. "What you did today, coming all this way through the storm, I don't know many who would have." Zach looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Any decent man would have. But they didn't. You did." Faith held his gaze steadily. "Why me, Mr. Zane? Surely there were others closer to your ranch who might have needed help." Zach's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since he'd decided to make this journey. The answer that came to mind wasn't one he was ready to share, that he'd thought of her first, that the idea of her alone in the cold had driven him to action before any other consideration. "You're up here alone," he said finally. "No neighbors for miles. It didn't seem right." Faith studied him, sensing there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons." They finished the meal, and Zach insisted on bringing in the rest of the wood before fully settling in for the night. With the fresh supply stacked beside the stove and a good fire going, the cabin was almost comfortable. The sleeping arrangements, however, presented a challenge. "You take the bed," Zach said firmly, eyeing the narrow cot in the corner. "I'll make do on the floor." "Absolutely not," Faith countered. "You've spent the day battling through snow and cutting wood. You need proper rest more than I do." "Miss Jones, Faith," she interrupted. "If we're going to be snowed in together, you might as well use my given name." A ghost of a smile touched Zach's lips. "Faith, then, but I'm still taking the floor." She recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and decided not to argue further. Instead, she gathered blankets and her spare pillow, making a pallet for him as comfortable as possible. "At least take these," she said, offering the bedding. "And please call me Zach. Mr. Zane makes me feel like my father." Faith smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since arriving. It transformed her face, bringing color to her cheeks and a sparkle to her green eyes that made Zach's heart skip a beat. "Zach, then," she agreed, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. They prepared for sleep in awkward silence, both acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation, yet equally aware of its necessity. Faith changed into her nightgown behind a suspended blanket, while Zach removed only his boots and outer layers, keeping on his long underwear for both warmth and modesty. "Good night, Zach," Faith said softly, blowing out the lantern and plunging the cabin into darkness save for the red glow from the stove. "Good night, Faith," he replied, his deep voice seeming to resonate in the small space. Neither slept immediately. Faith lay listening to Zach's breathing, finding comfort in the presence of another human after days of isolation. Zach stared at the ceiling, trying not to think about the woman just a few feet away, the scent of her hair something like lavender lingering in his senses. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tension was building, one neither of them had anticipated when the day began. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had intensified overnight, driving fresh snow against the cabin with such force that it seemed to make the entire structure shudder. Faith woke to find Zach already up, adding wood to the stove and heating water for coffee. "Morning," he said gruffly when he noticed her stirring. "Storm's worse." Faith sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. "How much worse?" "Bad enough that we won't be going anywhere today," Zach replied, pouring the hot water into a pot with ground coffee beans. "Maybe not tomorrow either." The reality of their situation settled over them, days together in this small space, with only each other for company. Faith wasn't sure whether the flutter in her stomach was anxiety or something else entirely. "I'll get dressed," she said, waiting for Zach to turn his back before slipping out of bed and behind the blanket partition. When she emerged, fully clothed in a simple wool dress, Zach had breakfast waiting. Biscuits made from the flour he'd brought, warmed over the stove with a bit of honey. "Not much of a cook," he apologized, "but it's hot." "It's perfect," Faith assured him, accepting a tin cup of coffee. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence, the howl of the wind outside making conversation difficult anyway. After breakfast, Faith insisted on washing the dishes with melted snow, while Zach checked on Brutus, who was sheltered as best as possible in a lean-to Zach had constructed against the side of the cabin. "He's cold but holding up," Zach reported upon returning, stamping snow from his boots. "Gave him some oats from my pack." Faith nodded, grateful for his consideration toward the animal. "What should we do today?" It was a simple question that highlighted the strangeness of their situation. Two virtual strangers, trapped together with nothing but time on their hands. "Could use some more wood," Zach said practically, "and need to clear some of the snow from the roof before it gets too heavy." "I can help with that," Faith offered, eager to be useful. Zach looked like he might refuse, but then nodded. "Extra hands would make it go faster. But we'll need to be careful. Snow's deep enough to get lost in just a few feet from the door." They spent the morning working together, Faith holding a rope tied to Zach's waist as he ventured further from the cabin to gather more wood. The physical labor and shared purpose eased some of the awkwardness between them, and by midday, they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Inside again for a lunch of dried beef and the last of the biscuits, Faith found herself studying Zach when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful precision with which his large hands handled the delicate china cup she'd given him for coffee. "You're staring," Zach said suddenly, catching her gaze. Faith flushed, embarrassed at being caught. "I was just thinking that I know very little about you, despite you being my rescuer." Not much to know, Zach replied with a shrug. Been working at Broken Spur for 10 years. Before that, Texas. Before that, not much worth mentioning. 10 years is a long time to work on one ranch, Faith observed. You must like it there. It's good work. Honest work. Zach took a sip of his coffee. What about you? What brought you out here all alone? It was the most direct question he'd asked her, and Faith found herself wanting to answer honestly. Freedom, mostly. My parents died 2 years ago. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I had an uncle in Kansas who wanted me to come live with him and his family, but he had a son he thought would make me a good husband, Faith said, a hint of bitterness in her tone. I had other ideas about my future. My parents left me enough to start fresh somewhere new, so I came west. To make remedies, Zach said, nodding toward her shelf of dried herbs and tinctures. Faith smiled, pleased he'd noticed. My mother taught me. She was a healer of sorts back in Pennsylvania. People here need medicines as much as anywhere, and it gives me independence. That salve you gave me for my rope burn, Zach said, flexing his right hand unconsciously. Worked better than anything the doc in town ever prescribed. You remember that? Faith asked, surprised. Zach's eyes met hers briefly before looking away. Hand healed clean, no scar. There was something in his voice, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Faith felt her heartbeat quicken inexplicably. I'm glad it helped. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Then the wind gave a particularly violent howl, breaking the spell. Better check the roof again, Zach said, standing abruptly. Snow's still coming down heavy. Faith nodded, gathering the dishes. I'll tidy up here. As Zach headed outside, Faith found herself watching him go with a strange sense of loss. In just a day, she'd grown accustomed to his presence, the solid reliability of him. The cabin felt emptier without him in it, despite its small size. She busied herself with chores, trying not to analyze these new feelings too closely. It was natural to feel attachment to someone who had saved her life, she reasoned. Nothing more than gratitude and the heightened emotions of their unusual circumstances. Yet when he returned, cheeks red from the cold and snow dusting his shoulders, the leap of her heart told a different story. The afternoon passed with them finding ways to occupy themselves in the small space. Zach repaired the damaged door as best he could, while Faith took inventory of their supplies, calculating how long they could last if the storm continued. A week, maybe more if we're careful, she concluded, looking up from her notes. Storm won't last that long, Zach assured her, testing the strength of his door repair. I've never seen one go more than 5 days in these parts. And it's already been 4 days for me, Faith said, hope rising in her voice. Which means the worst should pass soon, Zach agreed, though his expression remained cautious. But the snow will take longer to clear. Trails might not be passable for some time yet. Faith nodded, understanding the implication. Even after the storm, they might be stranded together for days. The thought should have worried her more than it did. As evening approached, Faith prepared another simple meal from their supplies. This time, Zach insisted on helping, and they worked side by side at her small table, their arms occasionally brushing in the confined space. Each accidental touch sent a jolt of awareness through Faith, and she couldn't help noticing that Zach seemed increasingly careful about maintaining distance between them. Tell me about Texas, Faith said as they ate, seeking safe conversation. Zach's expression softened slightly. Hot. Flat in parts, wild in others. Good cattle country but hard living. Why did you leave? A shadow crossed his face. Some places hold more bad memories than good after a while. Faith sensed she'd touched on something painful and changed direction. And Colorado. What brought you here specifically? A cattle drive initially, Zach said, relaxing slightly. Like the mountains. Reminded me that the world's bigger than my problems. It was perhaps the most revealing thing he'd said about himself, and Faith found herself warming to this glimpse of his inner thoughts. I feel that way too. The first time I saw the Rockies, I couldn't believe anything could be so majestic. Worth the journey west, just for that view, Zach agreed, a rare smile touching his lips. That smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and crinkling the corners of his eyes. Faith found herself staring again, captivated by this new side of him. You should do that more often, she said without thinking. Do what? Smile. Zach looked surprised, then slightly embarrassed. Not much cause for it usually. That's a shame, Faith replied softly. It suits you. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. Zach's gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest moment before he cleared his throat and stood, breaking the connection. Should check on Brutus before it gets any darker, he said, reaching for his coat. Faith nodded, her heart racing inexplicably. Of course. Left alone in the cabin, Faith pressed her hands to her heated cheeks. What was happening to her? This man was practically a stranger, yet she found herself drawn to him in a way she'd never experienced. Perhaps it was just the intimacy forced upon them by circumstance, gratitude, and proximity creating a false sense of connection. But when Zach returned and their eyes met again, Faith knew it was more than that. Much more. They settled in for the night with the same awkward dance as before, Faith changing behind the blanket partition, Zach making his bed on the floor. But tonight, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken awareness. Good night, Faith, Zach said, his voice lower than usual in the darkness. Good night, Zach, she replied, lying awake long after his breathing had deepened into sleep, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The second day of their confinement dawned with a subtle change in the air. The wind's howl had diminished to a moan, and the constant patter of snow against the windows had lessened. Zach noticed it immediately upon waking, his senses attuned to weather changes after years of working outdoors. Storm's breaking, he announced as Faith stirred from sleep. She sat up quickly, hope brightening her face. Really? Listen, Zach said, tilting his head toward the window. Wind's dying down, still snowing, but not as heavy. Faith listened, realizing he was right. The constant roar that had been her companion for days had softened to a more intermittent sound. Does that mean we can leave soon? Something flickered in Zach's expression, disappointment perhaps, before he schooled his features back to neutral. Not yet. Snow's still deep, and more trails need clearing. But it's a good sign. Faith nodded, ignoring the confusing twinge of disappointment she felt at the prospect of their time together coming to an end. I'll make breakfast. They fell into an easy routine that morning, moving around the small cabin with increasing comfort in each other's presence. Faith noticed that Zach no longer seemed quite so careful about maintaining distance between them, occasionally letting his hand brush hers when passing items or standing closer than strictly necessary when they worked together. After breakfast, Zach ventured outside to assess their situation more thoroughly. Faith watched from the doorway as he waded through snow that still reached above his knees in places. Trail toward town is completely blocked, he called back to her, pointing at a wall of snow where the path should be. Drifts are higher than a man's head in some places. How long before we can get through? Faith asked. Zach studied the terrain, calculating. 3 days, maybe 4 with just me digging. Less if someone comes from town with help, but they may have their hands full with folks closer in. 4 more days. The thought sent an unexpected thrill through Faith that she quickly tamped down. It wasn't proper to feel such excitement at being stranded with a man she barely knew, no matter how kind or handsome he might be. "I can help dig," she offered. Zach looked like he might refuse, then nodded. "More hands make lighter work, but we pace ourselves. Snow digging is exhausting, and cold makes it dangerous if you sweat too much." They worked together that morning, clearing a wider area around the cabin and beginning to create a path toward town. It was back-breaking labor, but Faith welcomed the physical exertion after days of confinement. She found herself watching Zach as he worked, admiring the power in his shoulders as he lifted shovel after shovel of heavy snow. By midday, they were both exhausted and returned to the cabin for a rest and warm meal. Faith's cheeks were flushed from exertion and cold, her hair coming loose from its pins, and she laughed as she stamped snow from her boots. "I don't think I've worked that hard since helping my father build our garden wall when I was 16, she admitted, accepting a cup of hot coffee from Zach with grateful hands. "You're stronger than you look," Zach observed, a note of admiration in his voice. "Most women are," Faith replied with a smile. "We're just not often given the chance to show it." Zach considered this, nodding slowly. "Reckon that's true. My mother could outwork most men I knew when necessity called for it." "You don't speak of your family much," Faith noted gently. Zach's expression closed slightly. "Not much to tell. Father died when I was young. Mother raised 4 of us on her own. I was the oldest." "And your siblings?" "Sister married a shopkeeper in Austin. 2 brothers headed to California during the gold rush. Haven't heard from them in years." His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate further. Faith respected his privacy and changed the subject. "Do you think anyone in town will be worried about us?" "Hank, the foreman at Broken Spur, knows I came to check on you," Zach said. "He thought I was crazy, but he knows. He'll raise the alarm if I don't come back once trails start clearing." The thought that Zach had risked his life for her against the advice of others made something warm unfurl in Faith's chest. "You came anyway, even though he told you not to." Zach met her eyes steadily. "Some things are worth the risk." The simple statement hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Faith looked away first, her heart beating faster. "We should get back to digging while there's still daylight," she said, rising from the table. The afternoon passed with more labor, broken by rest periods when the cold became too bitter to bear. By sunset, they had cleared a significant area around the cabin and made progress on a path that might eventually reach the main trail to town. Exhausted but satisfied with their work, they retreated to the warmth of the cabin as darkness fell. Faith prepared a simple stew from their dwindling supplies, while Zach tended the fire and checked on Brutus. "He's doing well," Zach reported when he returned. "Tough old horse. Been through worse with me." "You've had him long?" Faith asked, stirring the pot of stew. 8 years, Zach said with obvious affection. "Bought him as a half-broke 3-year-old that nobody wanted. Mean as a snake back then, but we came to an understanding." "And what was that understanding?" Faith asked, smiling at the warmth in his voice when he spoke of his horse. "That I'd treat him fair if he did the same for me," Zach said simply. "Horse or human, that's all most of us want in the end." Faith nodded, struck by the wisdom in his words. "That's a good philosophy for life, Zach Zane." He looked almost embarrassed at her approval. "Just common sense." "Not as common as you might think," Faith replied softly. They ate their stew in companionable silence, both too tired for much conversation. As Faith washed the dishes afterward, she found herself studying Zach's profile in the warm glow of the lantern light. The strong line of his jaw, softened now by several days' worth of beard growth. The careful way he handled her books when he picked one up to examine it. The gentleness in hands strong enough to dig through feet of snow. "You're staring again," Zach said without looking up from the book. Faith flushed, caught for the second time. "I was just thinking." "About," she hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About how strange it is that I feel like I know you better after 3 days than people I've seen every week for 2 years in town." Zach closed the book and turned to face her fully. "Sometimes it takes being trapped together to really see a person." "And what do you see when you look at me, Zach?" Faith asked, surprised by her own boldness. His eyes, dark in the lamplight, held hers. "I see a woman braver than most men I know. Smart, kind." He paused as if weighing his next words carefully. "Beautiful." The last word hung in the air between them. Faith's breath caught in her throat as heat crept up her neck into her cheeks. "I'm not," she began to protest. "You are," Zach interrupted quietly. "First time I saw you in town, trading those remedies of yours, I thought you were the prettiest thing I'd ever seen. Still do." Faith's heart hammered in her chest. No man had ever spoken to her so directly with such honest admiration. "Why didn't you ever say anything? In town, I mean." Zach gave a rueful half-smile. "What would a woman like you want with a saddled tramp like me? You've got education, refinement. I've got calloused hands and not much else to offer." "That's not true," Faith said earnestly, moving toward him without thinking. "You're kind and brave and honest. Those are worth more than any refinement." They were standing close now, close enough that Faith could see the flecks of gold in Zach's brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Faith," he said her name like a warning or perhaps a prayer. She didn't move away. "Couldn't?" "Yes. If I stay this close to you much longer, I'm going to do something that might not be proper." Faith's breath caught. "What if I don't want you to be proper right now?" Something flared in Zach's eyes, but still he hesitated. "You're vulnerable, been alone, scared. Might not be thinking clear." "I've never thought more clearly in my life," Faith whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek, feeling the rough texture of his beard beneath her fingertips. That touch broke his restraint. With a soft groan, Zach leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, but when Faith's arms wound around his neck in response, it deepened into something more urgent, more needful. Faith had been kissed before, chased. Awkward encounters with boys back east, but nothing like this. Zach kissed her like a man dying of thirst who'd found water, with a passion that made her knees weak and her heart race. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since the first time you smiled at me in town," he admitted hoarsely. "Why did you wait so long?" Faith asked, her fingers still tangled in his hair. "Waiting for the right moment, I guess," Zach replied with a small smile. "Though I didn't expect it to take a blizzard to get us here." Faith laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in days. Perhaps the storm had a silver lining after all. Zach's expression grew serious. "Faith, I don't want you thinking this is just because we're trapped here together. What I feel for you, it started long before this storm." The sincerity in his voice made her heart swell. "I believe you," she said simply, because she did. He kissed her again, more softly this time, a promise rather than a passion. When they parted, Faith felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them, a door opening to possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine before. That night, they still maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, Zach insisting on propriety, despite their changed relationship. But Faith fell asleep with her fingers touching her lips, remembering the feel of his kiss, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally broken. Sunlight sparkled off the pristine white landscape, nearly blinding in its intensity. Faith woke to find Zach already outside, clearing more snow from around the cabin with renewed vigor. She watched him from the doorway, her heart light despite the challenges still facing them. The snow remained deep, the trail to town still blocked, but somehow these obstacles seemed less daunting than before. "Beautiful day," Zach called when he spotted her. His smile was open now, unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. "It is," Faith agreed, stepping carefully onto the packed snow. "How's our path coming along? Making good progress," Zach said, gesturing toward the trail they'd started the day before. "Another day, maybe two, and we'll reach the main path." Faith nodded, trying to ignore the twinge of disappointment at the thought of their time together coming to an end. What would happen when they returned to normal life? Would Zach still look at her the way he had last night, or would he retreat back behind his reserved exterior? As if sensing her thoughts, Zach set down his shovel and approached her, snow crunching under his boots. "Something troubling you?" Faith hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was wondering what happens when we get back to town. Between us, I mean." Zach's expression softened. "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know," Faith admitted. "This has all been so unexpected. I don't have much experience with." She trailed off, frustrated by her inability to articulate her feelings. Zach took her gloved hands in his. "Faith, I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. What I feel for you didn't start with this storm, and it won't end with it either. But I won't push you for more than you're ready to give." The sincerity in his voice settled something within her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just need time to sort through everything." "Time I can give," Zach assured her, bringing her hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Now, how about helping me with this path? Sooner we clear it, sooner we can see what comes next." They worked together through the morning, the physical labor providing a welcome outlet for the emotions swirling between them. By midday, they had made significant progress, the path now extending nearly halfway to the main trail. As they paused for a rest, Zach suddenly straightened, his head tilting as if listening. "Do you hear that?" Faith strained her ears. In the distance, faint but distinct, came the sound of voices and the crunch of snow under multiple feet. "Someone's coming," she exclaimed, hope surging through her. Zach nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "Sounds like a rescue party." They hurried toward the sounds, following their partially cleared path and then pushing through deeper snow. After about 10 minutes of difficult travel, they crested a small rise and saw a group of men working their way toward them, shovels in hand, breaking through the snow-choked trail. "Hank," Zach called, recognizing the foreman at the head of the group. The older man looked up, relief visible on his weathered face even at a distance. "Zach, thought we might find you frozen solid by now." "Takes more than a little snow to put me down," Zach called back with a laugh. The rescue party, consisting of Hank and 3 other cowboys from the Broken Spur, reached them quickly once they spotted them. Hank's shrewd eyes took in Faith standing close to Zach, their proximity speaking volumes. "Miss Jones," he said, tipping his hat. "Glad to see you safe and sound." "Thanks to Mr. Zane," Faith replied with a grateful smile. "Figured he'd made it to you when the storm broke, and he still hadn't come back," Hank said. "Boss sent us out to dig you both out as soon as the weather cleared enough." "Appreciate it," Zach said, clapping the older man on the shoulder. "We've been working on a path from the cabin, but it's slow going with just the 2 of us." "Well, now you've got reinforcements," Hank declared. "We can have you both back to town by nightfall if we push hard." Faith's heart sank at how quickly their time together was coming to an end, but she forced a smile. "That would be wonderful. I'm sure everyone in town has been worried." "They have at that," Hank confirmed. "Doc Willis was particularly concerned, knowing you were up here alone when the storm hit." With the additional help, clearing the remaining path took only a few hours. Faith packed her most essential belongings while the men worked, preparing to leave the cabin that had been both her prison and the setting for the most unexpected chapter of her life. When everything was ready, Zack helped her mount Brutus, insisting she ride while he walked alongside. The other men had brought an extra horse for Zack, but he gave it to Hank instead, preferring to stay close to Faith as they made their slow journey toward town. "You don't have to walk," Faith protested, feeling guilty as she watched him trudge through the snow. "I've walked further in worse conditions," Zack assured her. "Besides, gives me an excuse to stay near you." His words warmed her despite the cold air. As they traveled, Zack kept one hand resting on Brutus's neck, occasionally brushing against Faith's leg in a touch that seemed both protective and possessive. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally reached the outskirts of Golden. The town was still partially snowbound, with drifts piled high against buildings and makeshift paths carved between them. People emerged from stores and homes as their party approached, word of their return spreading quickly. "Faith, thank goodness," Dr. Willis called, hurrying toward them as fast as the snow would allow. The older man had been a friend since her arrival in town, appreciative of her healing knowledge and herbs. "I'm fine, Doctor," Faith assured him as Zack helped her dismount. "Thanks to Mr. Zane." The doctor turned to Zack with obvious gratitude. "Young man, what you did was both incredibly brave and incredibly foolish, but I thank God you did it." Zack nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what needed doing." By now, a small crowd had gathered, and Faith found herself separated from Zack as townspeople surrounded them, asking questions and expressing relief at their safe return. Mayor Thompson pushed through the crowd, his round face red from the cold. "Miss Jones, we were about to organize a larger search party when this storm cleared," he said. "But it seems Mr. Zane beat us to it. You must both be exhausted. Mrs. Thompson has prepared rooms at our house for you both until you can return to your cabin." Faith glanced at Zack, catching his eye across the crowd. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of all that had happened, all that had changed. "That's very kind, Mayor Thompson," Faith said, turning back to the portly man. "But I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," the mayor insisted. "It's the least we can do. Your cabin won't be accessible for days yet, not until more snow melts." Faith knew he was right and nodded her acceptance. Zack, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with his ranch boss, who had pushed through the crowd to speak with him. Faith couldn't hear what they were saying, but Zack's expression was serious, nodding occasionally in response. As the crowd began to disperse, people returning to their homes in the fading light, Faith found herself being guided toward the mayor's large house by Mrs. Thompson, a kindly woman who fussed over her like a mother hen. "You poor dear, trapped in that cabin for days. You must be starving for proper food and a warm bath," she clucked, taking Faith's arm. Faith allowed herself to be led away, casting one last glance over her shoulder at Zack, who was still engaged in conversation with his employer. He looked up just as she was about to turn away, their eyes meeting briefly. He gave her a small nod, a promise in his gaze that made her heart skip. Whatever came next, Faith knew with certainty that their story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The Thompson home was the largest in Golden, a 2-story clapboard structure with actual glass windows and a parlor boasting a piano. Faith was shown to a comfortable guest room where Mrs. Thompson immediately ordered a hot bath prepared and laid out a borrowed nightgown. "The men will be staying at the hotel," Mrs. Thompson informed her as she bustled about the room. "Mayor thought it more appropriate, you understand. But Mr. Zane asked me to tell you he'll call tomorrow if that's agreeable." Faith couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. Yes, that would be very agreeable. Thank you. After the older woman left, Faith sank into the steaming bath with a sigh of pure pleasure. The hot water soothed muscles aching from days of cold and exertion. But her mind remained full of Zach, his smile, his kiss, the feel of his hand in hers. It seemed impossible that just days ago he had been barely more than a stranger to her, someone she'd exchanged pleasantries with in town, but little more. Now she felt connected to him in ways she couldn't fully articulate, as though the isolation of the storm had stripped away all pretense and allowed them to see each other truly. After her bath, Faith joined the Thompsons for dinner, where she recounted a carefully edited version of her ordeal and rescue. She spoke of Zach's bravery and kindness, but kept the more personal aspects of their time together private, a precious secret she wasn't ready to share. "That young man risked his life," Mayor Thompson said, shaking his head in wonder. "Not many would have ventured out in such conditions." "He's a good man," Faith said simply, the words inadequate to express what she now felt for Zach. "Indeed, Mrs. Thompson agreed with a knowing smile that made Faith wonder how transparent her feelings might be. "And quite handsome, too, for a cowboy." Faith felt herself blushing and quickly changed the subject, asking about how the town had fared during the storm. The conversation moved on, but she caught Mrs. Thompson watching her thoughtfully throughout the evening. That night, lying in a proper bed for the first time in days, Faith found sleep elusive. The room was warm, the bed soft, yet she missed the small cabin and, more surprisingly, Zach's presence nearby. She had grown accustomed to falling asleep to the sound of his steady breathing, the knowledge of his protective presence just feet away. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of a thaw, the February sun gaining strength as it climbed higher. Faith dressed in clothes borrowed from Mrs. Thompson's niece, who was closer to her size, and went downstairs to find Zach already in the parlor, hat in hand, engaged in conversation with the mayor. He stood when she entered, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Miss Jones," he greeted her formally, conscious of the mayor's presence. "Hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Zane," Faith replied, matching his formality while her heart raced at simply seeing him again. "And yourself?" "Fine, thank you." A ghost of a smile played at his lips, telling her he found this proper charade as amusing as she did after the intimacy they'd shared. "Mr. Zane was just telling me about the condition of the trail to your cabin," Mayor Thompson said. "It seems it will be at least another week before it's passable enough for you to return safely." "A week," Faith echoed, both dismayed at being displaced for so long and secretly thrilled at the excuse to remain in town closer to Zach. "I'd be happy to escort you up there to collect anything you need once the main path is cleared," Zach offered. "Should only be 2 or 3 days for that portion." "That's very kind," Faith said, their eyes meeting in understanding. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Well, I have business at the town hall. Mrs. Thompson has gone to the mercantile. I trust you two will be fine here for a while. Perhaps Mr. Zane could keep you company, Miss Jones, until my wife returns." It was a surprisingly liberal suggestion from the usually proper mayor, but Faith wasn't going to question it. "That would be lovely if Mr. Zane has the time." "I do," Zach confirmed quickly. As soon as the mayor departed, the formal facade dropped, and Zach crossed the room to take Faith's hands in his. "Been wanting to do this since I saw you come down those stairs," he said softly, bringing her fingers to his lips. Faith's breath caught at the tender gesture. "I missed you last night," she admitted. "Isn't that strange? After only a few days together." "Not strange at all," Zach assured her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Felt the same way. Hotel room felt too big and too empty without you nearby." They moved to sit on the sofa, closer than propriety might dictate but not caring. For a moment they simply looked at each other, drinking in the sight after the brief separation. "You look different," Faith said finally. "In town clothes." Zach glanced down at his clean shirt and brushed vest, a far cry from the practical work clothes he'd worn at the cabin. "Cleaned up to call on a lady," he explained with a small smile. "Wasn't sure when I'd get another chance to see you alone." "And now that you have me alone, Mr. Zane, what do you intend to do?" Faith asked, a teasing note entering her voice. Zach's smile widened and he reached out to touch her cheek gently. "Well, Miss Jones, I was thinking I might kiss you again if that's agreeable." "Very agreeable," Faith whispered, already leaning toward him. This kiss was different from their first, less urgent but no less meaningful, a gentle exploration rather than a breaking dam. Faith's hands came up to rest on Zach's chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her fingertips as his arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "You make it hard for a man to think straight, Faith Jones." "Good," she replied with a soft laugh. "You're not alone in that feeling." They stayed close, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Zach told her more about his life before Colorado, growing up in Texas, losing his father to a cattle rustler's bullet when he was just 12, working from boyhood to help support his mother and siblings. "Is that why you became a cowboy?" Faith asked, her hand entwined with his between them on the sofa. Zach nodded. "Wasn't much else a boy with strong arms and little schooling could do in those parts. Turned out I had a knack for it: horses, cattle, reading weather. Made a decent living, enough to help my mother until my siblings were grown." "And then you came west," Faith prompted. A shadow crossed his face. "After my mother passed. Nothing keeping me in Texas then, and I'd heard Colorado ranch hands earned better pay. Signed on with a cattle drive headed this way and never looked back." Faith squeezed his hand, sensing the old grief beneath his matter-of-fact tone. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Been 10 years now," Zach said quietly. "She'd have liked you, though. Always said I needed a woman with sense and spine." Faith laughed softly at that. "And do you think I qualify, Mr. Zane?" "More than any woman I've ever known," Zach replied with such sincerity that Faith's breath caught. Before she could respond, the front door opened, and Mrs. Thompson's voice called out, "I'm home, dear. And I've brought company." They separated hastily, putting a respectable distance between them on the sofa just as Mrs. Thompson entered the parlor, followed by Dr. Willis and, to Faith's surprise, Reverend Porter. "Oh, Mr. Zane, you're still here. How lovely," Mrs. Thompson said with a knowing smile that suggested she wasn't at all surprised. "Reverend Porter was just asking after you both, and Dr. Willis wanted to check on Miss Jones's health after her ordeal." Faith rose to greet the newcomers, conscious of her flushed cheeks and hoping they would attribute it to the warmth of the fire rather than Zach's kisses. "I'm perfectly well, doctor, but thank you for your concern," she assured the elderly physician. "Miss Jones, Mr. Zane," Reverend Porter said, nodding to each of them. "The town is abuzz with the tale of your rescue, sir. Quite heroic." Zach stood, uncomfortable as always with praise. "Just did what anyone would do, Reverend." "I think not," the clergyman disagreed. "Venturing out in such conditions showed remarkable courage and concern for your fellow man or woman, in this case." He smiled kindly at Faith. "God's hand was surely guiding you both through this trial." Faith found herself wondering what the Reverend would think if he knew what had transpired in her cabin: the kisses, the tender words, the growing feelings that had nothing to do with divine intervention and everything to do with human connection. The conversation continued for some time, with Zach eventually excusing himself to return to the ranch, promising to call again the following day. As he took his leave, his eyes met Faith's with a look that conveyed everything they couldn't say aloud, and she felt her heart expand with emotion. The next few days fell into a pattern. Zach would call at the Thompson house each morning, ostensibly to report on the progress of clearing the trail to Faith's cabin, but really to spend time with her. Mrs. Thompson, proving herself more progressive than her husband, often found reasons to leave them alone for short periods, though never long enough to raise eyebrows in the small community. On the fourth day after their rescue, Zach arrived with news. "Main trail's clear enough now," he announced. "I can take you up to your cabin today to collect whatever you need if you're willing." Faith agreed eagerly, both to retrieve some of her belongings and for the chance to spend more time alone with Zach. Mrs. Thompson insisted on packing them a lunch, her eyes twinkling with knowing approval as she handed the basket to Faith. "Don't rush back if the weather holds," she said with a conspiratorial smile. "The fresh air will do you good after being cooped up." The ride to Faith's cabin took longer than usual, the trail still partially obstructed in places despite the efforts to clear it. Zach rode Brutus, with Faith seated before him in the saddle, his arms around her waist to hold the reins. The closeness was both proper. He was simply ensuring her safety on the difficult trail and thrillingly intimate. "Been thinking about something," Zach said as they made their way carefully up a slippery incline. "What's that?" Faith asked, leaning back slightly against his solid chest. "About us. What happens next?" His voice was steady, but Faith could feel tension in the arms that encircled her. "I know it's been fast, just over a week since I dug you out of that cabin. Might seem crazy to some." Faith's heart quickened. "But not to you." "No," Zach said simply. "When you know, you know. At least, that's what my father always said about meeting my mother." Faith turned her head slightly to see his profile. "And what is it you know, Zach?" He guided Brutus around a fallen branch before answering. "That I love you, Faith Jones. That I think I started falling for you the first time I saw you in town, and being trapped with you in that cabin only made me sure of it." The words hung in the clear mountain air, a declaration both unexpected and inevitable. Faith felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of his statement. "You don't have to say anything back," Zach continued quickly. "I know it's sudden, and you might need more time to—" "I love you too," Faith interrupted, the words bursting from her like they couldn't be contained a moment longer. "I didn't expect it, didn't plan for it, but there it is. I love you, Zachariah Zane." Zach pulled Brutus to a halt, his arms tightening around her. For a long moment he just held her there on the snowy trail, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in. "When we get back to town," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I want to talk to Reverend Porter, do things proper." Faith's heart soared at the implication. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, cowboy?" She felt his chest rumble with quiet laughter. "Trying to. Not doing a very good job of it, am I?" Faith turned in the saddle as best she could to face him, not caring that they were stopped in the middle of a snowy trail. "Ask me properly, then." Zach's eyes, warm brown with flecks of gold, met hers directly. "Faith Jones, will you marry me?" "Not right away if you're not ready. We can have a long engagement if you want, but I know I don't want to spend another day of my life without knowing you'll be mine." "Yes," Faith whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "Yes, I'll marry you." Zach's face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen on him, transforming his usually serious countenance into something radiant. He leaned down to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and future, right there on the mountain trail with snow-covered pines as their only witnesses. When they finally reached Faith's cabin, it stood silent and cold, partially buried still in snow though no longer completely entombed. Zack helped her dismount, and they stood for a moment looking at the small structure that had brought them together. "Never thought I'd be grateful for a blizzard," Zack said, his arm around her shoulders. Faith leaned into him, savoring his warmth. "Nor I, but I am." They spent the afternoon gathering the items Faith would need until she could return permanently: clothes, books, her precious herbs and remedies. Zack repaired what damage the storm had caused, ensuring the cabin would be secure until she could move back. As they worked, Faith found herself imagining a future not alone in this small cabin, but with Zack. Perhaps on the broken spur, or maybe a place of their own someday. She could still make her remedies, perhaps even expand her practice with a larger garden. Zack could continue working with horses, something he clearly loved. Children someday with his brown eyes or her auburn hair. "What are you smiling about?" Zack asked, catching her daydreaming as he secured a loose shutter. "The future," Faith replied honestly. "Our future." His expression softened and he set down his tools to take her in his arms. "Sounds nice when you say it like that, our future." They shared a gentle kiss, then another, until Faith pulled away laughing. "If we keep this up, we'll never get back to town before dark." "Would that be so terrible?" Zack asked, only half joking. "Mrs. Thompson would scandalized," Faith replied with mock seriousness. "And we did promise to be back." Reluctantly, they finished their tasks and prepared to leave. As Zack was securing the last of Faith's belongings to Brutus's saddle, she took a final look around the cabin that had been her home for 2 years, and the sight of the most unexpected turn her life had taken. "Ready?" Zack asked, holding out his hand to her. Faith placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip. "Ready." The ride back to town was filled with plans and dreams, the kind of intimate conversation that new lovers share when the world seems full of possibility. By the time they reached Golden, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. True to his word, Zack spoke to Reverend Porter the very next day, with Faith by his side. The minister was surprised by the swiftness of their attachment, but could see the genuine love between them, and gave his blessing for a spring wedding. Once the snow had fully melted and traveling conditions improved, so Faith's friends from back east might attend. News of their engagement spread quickly through Golden, creating a buzz of excitement in the small community. Most were supportive, though some raised eyebrows at the short courtship. Mrs. Thompson became their staunchest defender, declaring to anyone who would listen that near-death experiences had a way of revealing true feelings faster than years of ordinary acquaintance. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Faith was able to return to her cabin as the snow melted, but spent much of her time in town, working with Mrs. Thompson and the other women on her wedding dress and arrangements for the ceremony. Zack continued his work at the broken spur but rode to see Faith every evening, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just sitting with her by the fire, talking about their future. They decided that after the wedding, Faith would move to the small house on the ranch property that came with Zack's position as head wrangler, a promotion his boss had recently given him. "It's not much," Zack had apologized when he first showed her the 2-room structure. "Nothing like your cabin." "It's perfect," Faith had assured him, already envisioning where her herbs would hang and how she could expand the small garden plot outside. "It's ours. That's what matters." As winter gave way to spring, the land around Golden transformed. Snow melted, revealing new grass and early wildflowers. The trees budded and then burst into leaf, and the bitter cold was replaced by mild days perfect for outdoor gatherings. On a bright May morning, with the Rockies standing majestically in the background, Faith Jones became Faith Zane in a ceremony attended by nearly everyone in Golden. She wore a simple white dress with lace that Mrs. Thompson had ordered specially from Denver, and carried a bouquet of early spring wildflowers. Zach, nearly unrecognizable in a new suit and clean-shaven for the occasion, waited for her at the front of the church with an expression of such joy and wonder that Faith felt tears threatening. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Porter began, his voice carrying through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Faith Jones and Zachariah Zane, whose love blossomed in the most unexpected of circumstances." Faith barely heard the words of the ceremony, too lost in Zach's gaze to focus on anything else. When it came time for their vows, his voice was steady and sure, while hers trembled slightly with emotion. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend finally declared. "You may kiss your bride." Zach leaned down to kiss her with a tenderness that belied the strength in his hands as they held hers. The church erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating not just a wedding but a love story that had already become something of a legend in the small town, the cowboy who had braved a blizzard for love. The celebration afterward was lively, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Faith and Zach moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but always gravitating back to each other, as if separation, even for minutes, was too much to bear. As the sun began to set, turning the snow-capped mountains pink once more, they slipped away from the festivities to begin their life together. Brutus, decorated for the occasion with ribbons on his bridle, carried them both to the small house on the Broken Spur property that was now their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zane," Zach said softly as he lifted her down from the saddle. Faith looked up at the modest house, at the man she now called husband, and at the mountains beyond that had brought them together in the most unexpected way. "Home," she echoed, the word filling her heart with joy. "Our home." Zach swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold as was tradition, both of them laughing as he nearly bumped her head on the doorframe. Inside, they found the house transformed. The women of Golden had been busy while they were at the church, decorating the small space with flowers and ribbons, leaving a cold supper on the table and turning down the bed with fresh linens. "Seems we have good friends," Faith said, touched by the thoughtfulness. "The best," Zach agreed, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "But right now, I'm only thinking about my wife." The word sent a thrill through Faith. "Your wife," she repeated, raising her face for his kiss. "I like the sound of that." That night, as they discovered each other fully for the first time, Faith thought of how a blizzard had brought them together, how cold and fear had given way to warmth and love. As Zach's hands and lips mapped her body with reverent care, she thanked whatever twist of fate had sent him to her cabin door that day. "I love you," he whispered against her skin, over and over, like a prayer or a promise. "And I love you," she answered, holding him close as they became one in the most ancient of ways. Later, lying in each other's arms, they talked about the future, about children they hoped to have, about Faith's plans to expand her healing practice, about Zach's dreams of someday having a small ranch of their own. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if that blizzard had never happened?" Faith asked, her head resting on his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. Zach's arms tightened around her. "Sometimes. Might have taken me years to work up the courage to court you proper. Or I might have moved on, never knowing what was waiting for me right here in Golden," Faith mused. It's strange to think that something so dangerous, so frightening, could lead to such happiness. Life's like that sometimes, Zach said, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. The worst storms can bring the best gifts. Faith smiled against his skin. When did you get so philosophical, cowboy? Must be my wife's influence, Zach replied, his chest rumbling with quiet laughter. She's the smart one in this marriage. And don't you forget it, Faith teased, tilting her face up for his kiss. Outside, a gentle spring rain began to fall, so different from the blizzard that had brought them together. But as Faith drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, she found herself grateful for the storm that had trapped her, and for the man who had dug through snow to reach her door. 5 years later, Faith stood on the porch of their small ranch house, watching as Zach taught their 4-year-old son, Thomas, to sit on a gentle old mare. Their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, played at Faith's feet, arranging pebbles in careful patterns that made sense only to her. The years had been good to them. After 3 years at the Broken Spur, they had saved enough to purchase their own small spread just outside of Golden 50 acres with good water and enough pasture for the horses Zach raised and trained. Faith's reputation as a healer had grown, and people now came from as far as Denver to seek her remedies and advice. "Look, Mama, I'm riding," Thomas called, his face alight with excitement as Zach led the mare in a small circle. "I see you, my brave boy." Faith called back, her heart swelling with love for her family. "He's a natural," Zach said proudly when they completed the circle and stopped near the porch. "Just like his mother." Faith laughed at that. "I believe you're the horseman in this family, husband." "Don't let her fool you, son," Zach said to Thomas with a wink. "Your mother rode through a blizzard with me once, bravest woman I ever knew." Thomas's eyes widened. "The blizzard story, tell me again, Papa." It had become a favorite bedtime tale, the story of how his parents met, edited, of course, for young ears, but full of adventure and romance nonetheless. "Later, little man," Zach promised, lifting the boy down from the mare. "After supper." As Thomas ran off to play with his sister, Zach stepped up onto the porch and drew Faith into his arms. At 35, he was still as handsome as the day he'd broken through her cabin door, though with a few more lines around his eyes and a touch of gray at his temples. Faith, now 29, had blossomed in motherhood, her figure fuller, her face serene with contentment. "Happy?" Zach asked, his arms encircling her waist as they watched their children play in the yard. "Completely," Faith assured him, leaning back against his chest. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Zach replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes I still can't believe my luck that a blizzard and a stubborn woman gave me all this." Faith turned in his arms to face him. "Luck had nothing to do with it. It was courage, yours and mine. The courage to face the storm and whatever came after." Zach smiled down at her, the love in his eyes as clear and strong as it had been that day in her snow-bound cabin when he'd first kissed her. "Whatever the reason, I thank God for it every day." "As do I," Faith whispered, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. Their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion of their first, tempered now with the deeper love that comes from years of shared joy and challenges. When they parted, Faith remained in the circle of Zach's arms, watching as the sun began its descent behind the mountains that had brought them together. In the distance, dark clouds were gathering, a spring thunderstorm approaching. But Faith felt no fear. She and Zach had weathered the worst nature could throw at them and emerged stronger for it. Whatever storms life might still hold, they would face them together, just as they had that fateful blizzard that had changed their lives forever. "I love you, Zachariah Zane," Faith said softly, the words no less meaningful for having been said countless times over their years together. "And I love you, Faith Zane," he replied, his arms tightening around her as the first distant rumble of thunder reached them. "Now and always." Their children came running at the sound, seeking the safety of their parents' presence as the storm approached. Zach scooped up Elizabeth while Thomas pressed against Faith's skirts, and together they went inside their home, the home they had built with love. The family forged in the aftermath of a blizzard that had once threatened to take everything, but had instead given them more than they had ever dreamed possible.